Hey everyone! Today I've got an incredible story to share with you about a group of people who changed the course of history forever. The Conquistadors. These were the Iberian adventurers of the 15th and 16th centuries, who ventured into uncharted lands, overcame unimaginable challenges, and left behind a legacy that's both fascinating and controversial. Their name literally means conquerors, and that's exactly what they did, often serving as the vanguard for empires. The conquistadors were a diverse bunch. Some were seasoned soldiers, while others were minor nobility with little to lose. Many of them had honed their skills in earlier European conflicts, like the Reconquista or the Italian Wars. But back home, opportunities were scarce. The New World, discovered by Christopher Columbus in 1492, offered a chance to rewrite their destinies. For these adventurers, the promise of untold wealth, fame, and even equality in a faraway land was irresistible. Some women, like Maria de Estrada, also joined these expeditions, defying the rigid conventions of European society. Imagine the audacity it took to set sail into the unknown, knowing the odds of survival were slim. Their ventures were high-stakes gambles. Funding an expedition required massive resources, from outfitting ships to gathering supplies, men, and horses. Often, groups of conquistadors would pool their resources, promising their monarchs a cut of whatever riches they found. It was a risky business. Disease and accidents claimed more lives than any enemy weapon, and only a handful of them struck it rich. But for those who did, the rewards were unimaginable. Figures like Hernán Cortés and Francisco Pizarro are infamous for their conquests. Cortés' campaign against the Aztecs in 1519, and Pizarro's conquest of the Inca Empire in 1532, were turning points in history. They were driven by more than just greed. A mix of religious zeal and ambition fueled their actions. Converting indigenous peoples to Christianity was often used as both a motivation and justification for their brutal methods. But make no mistake, these campaigns left a trail of destruction, suffering, and death. Today, their actions are remembered with a sense of revulsion, but back then, they were admired by many of their contemporaries. They embodied the late medieval crusading spirit, a worldview vastly different from our own. The conquistadors' success wasn't just due to their determination. Their weapons and tactics gave them a massive edge. Armed with steel swords, crossbows, cannons, and even attack dogs, they faced indigenous armies that, while vast in numbers, couldn't compete with such advanced technology. The cavalry alone was a game changer, with horses striking fear into those who'd never seen such animals before. On the flip side, the conquistadors weren't invincible. Indigenous warriors were skilled with their own weapons, like darts, arrows, and slings. They could exploit the weak points in a conquistador's armor, such as their faces. Ritualized warfare among indigenous peoples often played to the conquistadors' advantage, as local leaders, easily identified by their elaborate costumes, became targets on the battlefield. Despite their superior firepower, the conquistadors often adopted elements of local armor, like quilted jackets toughened with salt water. Traditional European metal armor was heavy and impractical in the humid climates of the Americas. Their iconic Mauryan helmets, with their distinctive crests, became a symbol of their identity, but practicality often trumped aesthetics in these harsh conditions. And their story wasn't just about battles and exploration. What happened after they conquered lands is just as important. Once the conquistadors had taken over an area, they wasted no time dividing up the treasure they found. They seized gold, silver, emeralds, pearls, and even valuable woods and animal hides. Instead of appreciating the cultural significance of the items, they melted down precious objects to make it easier to share. By the mid-1500s, over 100 tons of gold had been taken from the Americas, and by the end of the century, Spanish ships had carried 25,000 tons of silver back to Europe. But dividing the loot wasn't exactly fair. Some conquistadors gained immense riches and even titles or lands, while others ended up with very little. Arguments over who got what often turned ugly. Hernán Cortés, for example, faced legal challenges claiming he didn't share the wealth properly. Francisco Pizarro's disputes with his second-in-command, Diego de Almagro, turned violent and ended with Pizarro being assassinated in his own bed. Even after their deaths, these rivalries often carried on for generations. After the initial conquests, the focus shifted to a new phase called pacification. This was all about making the most of the newly conquered lands. The conquistadors set up forts to protect their gains and built churches to fulfill promises made to the Spanish crown. But as the colonies grew, managing them required skilled administrators and settlers from Europe. The conquistadors, known for their brutal tactics and lack of governing experience, were gradually replaced, much to their frustration. These adventurers had risked everything, but now they were being pushed aside in favor of a more organized system. This next stage of colonization focused on mining, plantations, and forced labor, often at the expense of indigenous people. The Spanish rulers wanted two things: to extract as many resources as possible, and to convert indigenous populations to Christianity. But these goals didn't always align. After all, it's hard to convince someone to adopt your religion when you've stolen their land and forced them into labor. The conquistadors' cruelty, along with European diseases, caused massive devastation. In Mexico, for example, the population fell from 25 million in 1520 to just 3 million by 1556. Similar tragedies unfolded wherever the conquistadors went. Even back then, some people spoke out against the conquistadors' actions. A Dominican friar named Bartolomé de las Casas, who had once been a conquistador himself, wrote about the horrors he had witnessed in his book, a very brief recital of the destruction of the Indies. His work influenced Spain to pass the new laws of 1542, which aimed to protect indigenous people. Unfortunately, these reforms faced strong opposition from the conquistadors and their descendants, who didn't want to lose their power or wealth. By this point, many conquistadors found themselves at a crossroads. Some returned to Spain empty-handed, while others tried to settle down as farmers, a far cry from the lives of adventure and riches they had dreamed of. But for a few, the lure of unexplored lands was impossible to resist. They ventured into new territories, hoping to find even more wealth. Diego de Almagro, for instance, explored Chile, while Francisco Vázquez de Coronado searched North America for mythical cities of gold. These expeditions rarely brought the riches they hoped for, but they did expand Europe's knowledge of the world and pave the way for future colonization.